everybody. We're excited to have here a couple of great guests, and we've got Harry Saluja, who's been with Chevron. He's actually more than just oil and gas. He's been in a variety of different industries in finance and such. He's worked with a range of IT roles, kind of going from IT infrastructure to cybersecurity, even cloud work. And then we also have Rob Carstons, and Rob is one of the Hyperdrive Agile coaches helping support Harry over at Chevron. And together they've got a very interesting topic, all of which we're kind of interested in. And we kind of scratch our heads because there are some Agilists who are thinking about how Waterfall and how does Waterfall play into the formula of an Agile transformation or an organization looking at Agile. And I think with the background of Harry and his skills in portfolio management and technology, and Rob's skills in coaching and Agile, together they're going to give us some insights. So with that, I'd like to hand this off to Harry and Rob. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn.
Thanks, Stacy. Appreciate it.
I don't think there's going to be lunch in this Lunch and Learn.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive in here. And maybe what we'll do is real quickly, just maybe kind of do a little bit more of a deeper dive into our introduction. So I'll let my colleague, Harry Saluja, go first. Harry?
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Show me. Okay, perfect. So thank you, Stacy, again, for the opportunity. Harry Saluja. I'm actually currently in a role of a manager for strategic portfolios. I've actually moved outside of IT recently from our big transformation that happened last year. So I'm within Chevron Pipeline and Power, acting as the manager for strategic portfolio. I've been in project management since 2004. And like Stacy said, like working in the financial and utility companies, and joined Chevron in 2010. So it's about 11 years with the company. My first exposure to Agile was in 2016, when one of the IT teams was exploring to use Agile. And I've seen Agile grow from one part of the IT within Chevron to now, all our digital platforms using Agile, even parts of upstream and downstream. And now within Pipeline and Power, all of our functions are actually using Agile. And that's the benefit I feel like I have now in this new role outside of IT, where I can influence, way beyond within IT. Just to kind of give you an example, we are planning and executing work for pipeline integrity, for health, safety, and environmental work using Agile. Field operational work is also being, adopting some Agile practices. Even the incident response, the recent Hurricane Ida response in Gulf Coast was, managed using Agile. Our operational technology, strategy development, automation, just to kind of name a few different disciplines we have, been exploring use of Agile. So we'll give you plenty of real life examples in this presentation. So stay tuned. Our objective today is to really make it worth your while and leave you with some nuggets and learnings that you can apply in your job right away. So I'm really excited to be here, share our experiences and learnings, and also share with you where we failed fast, or what our chairman and CEO Mike Worth likes to call learn fast, what some of the best practices we scaled within Pipeline and Power and overall Chevron. So with that, over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Harry. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Rob Carstons. I'm an enterprise Agile coach. I've been working with Harry and at Chevron's Pipeline and Power since January of 2020, helping the organization kind of make this transition to kind of this new way, this Agile way of working. I've been in the Agile space for nearly 11 years. Began in kind of the Scrum Master, product owner roles the first 3 years. And then moved into coaching, for the last 8 years. I've been in technology and project management space my entire career. Over the last 10 years, I've worked with companies such as Pacific Gas and Electric, ExxonMobil, Dell EMC, StubHub, and even Symantec prior to their being acquired by NortonLifeLock, just to name a few. Prior to that, was the director of the Global Technical Organization for the Americas for an international software and consulting services company that was based in Stockholm, Sweden. My professional career actually began as a software developer with that company. And I've also held positions in technical project and program management, as well as implementation manager for that same software and consulting services company. So thanks for having us today. And let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so Harry, where did the idea for the paper come from, right? This whole talk is based on this paper that you and I wrote. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. So, our workforce has been on an Agile journey, exploring Agile in different parts of the business, right? And by that, I just kind of mean all the different areas and the disciplines I mentioned, they have been on that journey for a while. At the beginning of this year, I was asked to help our executive leadership team with it, what this means to them. What role do they play in this new way of working? So we actually developed a structured experiential Agile learning program for them. And while taking our business unit president and his leadership team through it, in one of the sessions, an executive asked me, Harry, does Agile apply everywhere? And at that time, I wasn't sure how to answer it. I knew it doesn't apply everywhere, but I didn't know how to explain it. So then I kind of took that back, thought a lot about it, researched it, discussed with different folks, including yourself, Rob, and got some more different, inputs. And that's where we landed on deciding and writing a white paper. When we initially wrote this white paper, we actually published this within Chevron internally using Workplace, which is, an internal Facebook application. And we got a really good response. It was shared globally within the company, from Indonesia to Kazakhstan to Australia to, South American countries, even a lot of business units within the BU. And we realized it is actually a very common predicament and needs to be shared more broadly. So recently, this article, white paper, got published in the Society of Petroleum Engineers quarterly newsletter. And we're more than happy to share that link with you all. And now we are here today with you all to, with our fellow Agilists to share what our experience has been through this. And I believe the more we share our experiences and learn from each other, that the faster we can be more agile as a company within Chevron and even as an industry. So that's where, kind of what my journey has been until we got to the paper. So Rob, can you share what when I reached out to you, where were you in your journey with that?
Sure. Well, really what inspired me, Harry, was when I joined Chevron and began kind of engaging some of the existing teams. One of the patterns that I noticed was there were some teams that were struggling with how they were working. Some teams were experiencing large batches of work that were carrying over from sprint to sprint, right? Not uncommon. Others were just simply struggling with the concept of teaming. In one instance, a team was working on a large capital construction project, and that project included things such as like land acquisition, developing RFPs, permitting, right? These are not kind of the technology type things that we're used to when working in the IT or the technology space. And so much of that work was very linear in nature, and the team was struggling to deliver value in kind of these time boxes, right? These 2-week increments that they were trying to use Scrum. So you can imagine, the work the team was doing couldn't be accomplished in kind of these fixed time box, but the team knew exactly what they needed to do. Predictability was a challenge only in terms of how fast, for example, land acquisition might take or contract negotiations with vendors might take. And as Harry mentioned, right, we were also trying to see, how does Agile fit in different parts of the business, right? From strategy development to process improvements to small and large capital projects. And of course, we do get asked this question from time to time, which approach is better, Agile or Waterfall? And as you know, this isn't a simple question to answer, right? Because it's just not, right? There's a lot to be considered when asked this question. But when you're early in the transformation, right, sometimes these questions get asked, and you have to have some way of kind of explaining and kind of taking people through that. So then we kind of, back in September, Harry and I decided to publish this paper. It was actually published on September 16th. And I saw kind of writing the paper as kind of a way to broadly share what we were observing and to educate the organization. So some of the pitfalls Harry and I will talk about today were pitfalls that I felt needed to be addressed and Harry felt needed to be addressed, right? It's just a kind of a short list, but some pretty key ones that we thought were important to call out. You will notice, and I'll show you the paper in just a moment, but you will notice the paper is only 2 pages long. And that was intentional, right? We did use a lot of references, mainly because we wanted to keep it brief and simple. Again, kind of drinking our own Kool-Aid. We wanted people to read it, right? And if we didn't use the references, it probably likely would have been a series of papers, or it would have been a really long paper. And as you know, people don't generally want to read really long papers. So we felt this was enough to inform, and we can dive deeper without teams as needed, right, as questions come up. So the paper, as Harry mentioned, received a lot of traction within Chevron. And Harry and I did present it at an internal community of practice as well, where I think we had like 100+ people show up, just kind of like we were doing today. So it was great. One side note about the presentation today, we're using PowerPoint, right? I'm using PowerPoint to facilitate. And that's really simply what I'm using PowerPoint for, is just a facilitation tool. We're using it more from an outline perspective. So as we talk, but you will have access, if Sherry Ann, I don't know if you emailed it out or if it's a link you're going to put in the chat, a link to the PDF that actually contains the paper. I actually will kind of switch over to it and just show you briefly. So the paper kind of looks something like this. We don't get into the much detail, as Harry mentioned. We're going to take you through some real detailed business cases today that we don't really have the time in the paper to get to. The paper is fairly high level, so you're definitely going to get a lot more today. And then also, as Harry mentioned, this article was published in the Digital Energy Review in October, and as you can see there on page 13. It's probably floating around. If you look me up on LinkedIn or Harry up on LinkedIn, you'll find that we reposted this out there, so you'll be able to see that as well. All right. Also, Harry and I will be posing some questions to you along the way, and we'll ask that you use the chat feature for your responses. So we'll get a few slides in, we'll pose a few questions, probably do that about 3 times along the way. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post them in the chat. There's quite a few folks on the phone, so we want to be able to kind of organize the questions and be able to kind of see kind of first in, first out in terms of trying to respond to those. We'll do our best to address those questions along the way if we can. If not, we'll address them at the end when we open it up for Q&A.
Okay, great. So Rob, can you talk about what do you mean by context here?
Sure. So Harry, in my experience, I always like to start with understanding the work the team is doing, right? Understanding the backlog and the work they're doing, to me, is really important in helping determine, what approach the team could take when doing their work. So when I say context, I'm referring to whether the work kind of fits into this kind of complex context, right? Is the work in kind of this complex domain versus a complicated context, right? And of course, what's the difference and why does it matter? So an example of a complex context would be, the typical innovation projects that many of us have probably worked on, right? Where we may understand kind of the goal or the intent, but there's certainly some discovery and learnings that need to take place in order to come to a solution. So in many cases, we need to iterate on that solution, which then takes us to, incorporating feedback, applying that feedback to future iterations. Sometimes we think of complex context as areas where we can experiment, right, and learn some things along the way. In the paper, I use the example of COVID-19, but it's a great example of a very complex problem with no simple solution, right? And so while we've made great progress, we are still iterating on that today, 1.5 years later. So Harry, maybe you can give some additional examples also of some complex context from your experience.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, Rob. I have 3 examples in mind here. This first one is, this was a project called digital measurement. So in our pipeline business, we have these flow meters in the field that we deploy every few miles on the pipeline or at the custody transfer, where the product is being transferred from one party to the other. And the intent is to measure the volume of the product. right? So before, our field operators used to go to the field, capture the reading on the meter, come back to the office and enter that into the system. And then we would use that either for invoicing or inventory and whatnot, right? So we actually invested in a technology where we deployed a sensor sitting right next to the field, the flow meter, which was then capturing the reading and sending it to the cloud in an application to the cloud, where then the operator could actually do the exact same thing, get that reading sitting at their desk, right? So the complexity there was every field site was different, right? You can imagine we have thousands of miles of pipeline and in multiple custody transfer locations. So every site was different, had a bit of a unique, network design, even though we tried to standardize as much as possible, a unique, different bandwidth availability. And even on the back end, the integration of the systems was different, how to integrate. So if we try to do it in a complicated way of working, then we wouldn't have accomplished and delivered the value quickly. And we'll talk a bit more about that. So that was a kind of complex scenario. The second one scenario here is really around using virtual reality for training. So, and I want to put in a plug in here because it's very important to us. We spend a lot of money for public awareness as being a pipeline company. And I'm going to speak mostly to Texas, but I'm sure this applies at other states too. In Texas, if you are going to dig the ground, you need to call 811 before you do that, right? Because there might be pipelines and whatnot underneath the ground. So even if it's your backyard, right? Then when you call that 811, the service company, then distributes that call to all the providers who might be operating, in that area. As an example, there might be Xfinity lines, gas pipeline for residential areas, and in some cases, electric cables, right? So either for that reason, we actually have to kind of locate the pipeline, which is subsurface. And we have a role called facility inspector within the pipeline. So what this facility inspector has to do is really locate the pipeline, the subsurface pipeline, using a bunch of different equipment. And while they're doing that, it's a very dynamic environment. It could be, in the busy Los Angeles, streets or freeways or even flyovers in LA to Rockies mountain area where we have our operations, to all the way to Gulf Coast, marshland, a variety of terrain where our facility inspectors have to locate these pipelines that are in different depths, sometimes in pipeline corridors where we have multiple pipeline providers operating within a few feet from each other, anywhere from 8 to 20 pipelines within that area. And as they are locating this pipeline, they have to be careful and be watching at the third-party excavator who's helping dig the ground. The top priority for a facility inspector is to be safe and to keep everyone at the site safe. So that's their top priority. The second top priority is avoiding any line strikes. And by line strike, I don't mean by rupturing the line. That even if you hit the line that leads to damaging the coating of the pipeline, that is considered an incident for us. So that's how much careful we are. And you can imagine such a dynamic environment. Now, simulating that environment for a new facility inspector wasn't easy. So we actually, looked into virtual reality to see how we could, develop a training solution for the new facility inspectors. And, it got really complicated, and we had to kind of figure out and iterate on that. This last example here is actually not even a digital example. At one of the pipeline segments, we have a primary pump and a secondary pump, right? And we use pump to push the product through the pipeline. So we have a primary pump, a secondary pump, and a backup pump. And the objective of the team was to get down from, primary, secondary to just one pump along with the backup. And the complexity was really around, different flow rates throughout the day, different pressures, maximum operating pressures, the quantity of the product being pushed every day, every hour. So the team iterated on it and tried different scenarios and was able to get rid of the second pump, taking a risk-based approach. And this really helped not just reduce the cost, but also the emission from the secondary pump, really working towards our corporate strategy of higher returns and lower carbon, right? Those are some of the examples that talk about how complex scenarios could be, even outside of a typical, IT software development. So with that, Rob, if I kind of ask you, kind of give a few examples on the complicated context, please.
Sure. Thanks, Harry. So an example of a complicated context, and this is kind of a simple example, is you think about the building of a bridge, right? Bridges have been built for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? We've got engineers who understand what needs to be done and how to address problems. There's a high level of certainty that engineers can solve the problem of just simply crossing a river. And while there's, certainly could be challenges in achieving that build, we know that the engineers likely have encountered these problems in the past, right? And there's likely a number of solutions that they can pull from. An airplane is another example of a complicated context, right? The typical layperson may not fully understand what keeps a plane in the air, but there are engineers that understand exactly how it works, right? The systems that keep the plane flying and how to repair those systems and troubleshoot them. Also, there's the example we gave earlier regarding the pipeline construction project, right? We're laying new pipeline. So this type of work really kind of fits nicely into this complicated domain, right? The work is very linear in fashion and somewhat predictable and requires upfront planning and scheduling. So you can't, for example, lay new pipe until you acquire rights to the land.
Hey, I don't know if we could hear you, Rob. I think, Rob, your voice is breaking up.
Sorry, my audio cut out, so I should be back now.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to kind of restate kind of what I was just stating. So, the example I gave earlier about the pipeline construction project, right? So, we're laying new pipeline. This type of work really kind of fits nicely into this complicated domain. As I mentioned, the work is very linear in fashion, somewhat predictable, does require some upfront planning and scheduling. And, you can't lay pipe until you actually acquire rights to the land to actually, and the permits, right, to actually lay that pipe, right? You can't hire your contractors until you actually develop and submit RFPs, right? So it's very linear in fashion how this work is done. So it really doesn't benefit from the same approach we might take in a kind of a complex domain where experimentation, discovery, learning kind of help guide us on the solution, right? We don't want to experiment on a bridge. Where we're going to have people in cars crossing, right? There's too much risk involved in doing that. And there's some certainty, and we've got lots of experience doing that. So the application of complex versus complicated, some of you this may start to sound familiar to many of you, right? This kind of ties back to kind of that Cynefin framework, right? Which is a framework that was developed by Dave Snowden and used, to aid in decision making, right? It goes further than complex and complicated domains. We didn't want the paper to be focused on Cynefin, so we included the reference to a white paper. It's actually an HBR in the white paper. It's an HBR article that was written in 2007 by Dave Snowden and Mary Boone. Also felt that these were the domains that were most helpful in explaining context when people ask the question about, which one is better, which approach should we use, right? We kind of focus on complex versus complicated. So it keeps it simple, and so that's what you'll notice about why we kind of focused on this.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. And to our audience here, as we shared at the beginning, we want you to walk away with some nuggets. So with that intent, we would ask you to use the chat feature and share some of the examples of complex and complicated work in your area. What would that look like? Again, it's a two-way learning. So I'm kind of curious to hear if it resonated, and can you kind of come up with a couple examples here, one for each?
It looks like somebody put in the chat, this is starting to look like Cynefin. Great catch.
Katrina's got a really interesting question here. Are you saying that you're focusing on complex work, or are you saying that Agile is only appropriately used for complex work?
We will get to that. I will answer that shortly.
Yeah, good question.
Hey, Harry, it's Daniel here from London. So I kind of work in the same industry with you, but it's really interesting. And I posted in the chat there, basically, an example of what I consider complex for us, because I also work in the oil and gas, is, when we do turnarounds for the assets, maintenance works and stuff like that. We can determine exactly, the climate, the weather changes, and you've got to find the right window of opportunity before you can actually go ahead and do an MOT on a refinery. And that requires shorting the oil pipes down, making sure everyone is safe, doing all of those different things. And then also that's the cost in production, but also reactivating the refineries and all of that basically. And that basically is very complex. However, the complicated aspect of it is getting people on site, to be able to execute on the program and on the job. But really interesting, I'll be keen to understand, in this kind of scenario, what would you recommend? Would that be waterfall because of the scheduling and the planning, or would that be agile?
That's a really good observation, Daniel, and I really liked how you picked up on that, because we have had a few conversations on that too. And in writing the article, we said, turnover actually was one of the examples in complicated domain, because it's very well defined. People have been doing it for a long time. But again, it becomes complex when you find a brand new problem that you have never seen it before, right? But for the most part, in general, it is a complicated kind of context there.
Okay.
A great question and great observation. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, that is a great question, and that kind of goes really into most projects that are kind of fit into that complicated. Even the example I gave of the bridge, right? They're probably going to run into things along the way that they're going to have to kind of figure out, well, how do we solve it, right? But chances are that it's probably been solved before, right? But a decision needs to be made, right? So it doesn't mean that it's going to go together like a puzzle. But the general context is kind of more complicated than, say, complex.
Yeah.
I
also like, absolutely, you're welcome. I really like another example on the chat here from Missy, a new business opportunity that haven't done in the past for risk reasons. That's a great example. Missy, thank you for that.
All right, so we'll try to get some more questions as we go along, and at the end here, so we're about 37 minutes in here. So let's talk a little bit about kind of how work gets executed in general.
Rob, go ahead, Rob. I'll let you kind of take this one and then.
Sure, thanks. All right, so traditional project methodologies, right? Sometimes we refer to them as waterfall, right? These are these linear kind of phase gate approaches to delivering projects, right? And the expectation is that we can mitigate much of the risk early in the project by doing lots of upfront planning, eliminating uncertainty, ensuring predictable project delivery. Projects that have high levels of certainty and predictability and low levels of complexity, but may also be highly complicated, fit well into these types of approaches. So the turnaround might be a good example of that, right? But if you think about the construction of an oil refinery or the example of a bridge, right? These are highly complicated projects. It's been done before, the costs are high. And these types of projects, are very linear in nature. It doesn't mean we're not going to have a little bit of discovery, but there's not going to be too much discovery involved and uncertainty along the way, right? There are likely good practices and solutions that exist to address that uncertainty. And then allows that project to then adapt quickly. So another example is I've got a couple of neighbors here. It seems like everybody's putting in pools now. That's another example of kind of a complicated domain. It's right. They know exactly what to do when they're putting pools in, but they will run into issues along the way. One of my neighbors said, they got about 6.5 feet down, and then they discovered that it's like all rock, and they want to go 7.5 feet, right? And so now all of a sudden the price has gone up thousands of dollars. They ran into some unexpected issues. It doesn't mean they don't know how to solve the problem, right? It's just going to be much more expensive to do so. So Harry, can you talk a little bit about how projects were being executed in Chevron before 2016?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Again, from my lens, my first exposure to Agile was about that time. And I worked in multi-million-dollar IT programs using Waterfall. And we used to call that chip dip. It stands for CPDEP. Don't visualize chip and dip. It was a fancy way to call it, though. It stands for Chevron Project Development Execution Process, which was then renamed and branded to CPMS, Chevron Project Management Systems, which was a bit of a broader framework than just the project execution framework. And it was a very much phase gate driven framework, starting with business case development and approval in phase 1, in phase 2, generating and selecting the right alternative. Phase 3 was developing and approving, designs, and phase 4 implementation, and phase 5 operations turnover and training. So one of the biggest projects I worked on in Chevron, with that methodology, was redesigning our network architecture globally. That really meant kind of how do we connect every site back into Chevron. And as a project manager and then the program manager within that, my role, kind of almost two facets to it. My role and how I was interacting with the team, the decision executive, and the decision review board was one aspect of it. The other was really, how we were executing the project. So in some cases, when we did our phase 3 design work for all the sites, and then when we got to the implementation, we actually had to redo the design because the technology had changed by the time we got to the implementation, right? Because big players like Cisco and Juniper, they changed their design on switches and routers pretty quickly. So we had to quickly then react to that and be agile at the time. So that's how it was being done before. But now if you come and look at how we are executing projects like those, it's pretty amazing. It's almost a paradigm shift on how we are looking at our IT and digital projects.
Great, thanks, Harry. So then we've got these annual agile frameworks, right, or methods, right, as we all know, which are kind of focused on a set of values and principles, right? These values and principles kind of help shape that mindset, right, and the practices around kind of how we work. So when we think about principles and mindset, we're talking about things like individuals and interactions, simplicity, customer collaboration, right? Being able to respond quickly to change. And we think of the practices that kind of reinforce that mindset, right? We think of things like Scrum, right? The framework of Scrum, or the practice of writing user stories or relative estimation, right? Just to name a few. Each of these practices does help to reinforce the principles and mindset. And Scrum, as we know, right, being the most common framework, uses an iterative and incremental approach to building and delivering to its customers, right? We build iteratively, deliver incrementally. And Scrum works well where empirical learning or discovery or experimentation are necessary, right, to solve a problem or build a new product. And so while there are other methods that teams are using, the paper simply focused on the most common approach, right, which was Scrum. But for example, we do have some teams that are using a Kanban board, right? Simply making their work visible, allowing the team to manage flow and improve prioritization. We do see large capital projects that may be more traditional in terms of methodology, but using a Kanban board as a way to manage workflow once they get to the execution stages of the project, right? So we're starting to see some of these hybrids starting to kind of evolve throughout the organization. And it's also not uncommon for teams that are developing strategic plans, right, to use agile principles and practices to do so, right? And one example, I had a corporate team that was a cross-functional team representing different parts of the business. They began reviewing kind of the existing strategic objectives, comparing the new strategic objectives to identify gaps or opportunities. And then they developed a corporate strategy around achieving those new objectives, right? So the process was quite iterative, took them a few months to complete. We emphasized some key principles like feedback loops. We encouraged experimentation. We kind of reinforced, simplicity, keeping things simple. And this allowing the team to then build iteratively and deliver incrementally. And so while they didn't follow Scrum, Scrum by the book, right? We did reinforce a lot of these principles that Scrum reinforces. We incorporated team workshops, right, where the teams collaborated and brainstormed ideas, and to build and prioritize the backlog in addition to developing solutions. We began with kind of a high-level outline. We iterated on that outline with stakeholders using different methods of feedback, interviews, surveys. We iterated on kind of what we felt were some of the kind of this top strategic plans to achieve, those new objectives. And then we iterated on the details of executing that plan. So I'm sure many of you have seen, the kind of the iterative example of the painting of the Mona Lisa, right, where it begins with an outline and then a sketch followed by some coloring, and then ultimately, because of that continuous feedback, you end up with voila, the Mona Lisa, right? Very similar approach to developing kind of that strategic plan. So let's talk a little bit about some of the key pitfalls that we observed.
So Rob, let's start with this first one. What examples can you share where you observed teams applying Agile Scrum where it wasn't the right place for it?
Yeah. So Harry, as I began working with teams, one of the things I noticed was virtually every team being launched was a Scrum team. And as we just talked about, Scrum works well, where empirical learning is needed, and we need to kind of iterate on a solution, right? And it wasn't until I engaged with that team I talked about earlier, right, on that large pipeline construction project where the team asked me to kind of come in, help them with how they were working. Team members were really frustrated. The pushback was work couldn't be completed in kind of these short iterations. None of the work seemed to be kind of moving through their board. Some of the tasks, we talked about earlier, land acquisition, develop RFPs, contract negotiations, permitting. Many of these tasks could take months, especially when you have to get legal involved with contracts and negotiations. So this was one example that I noticed where the process was very linear in nature and kind of forcing the team and kind of working in these short iterations just it wasn't practical. So we had an opportunity to improve how we work by applying some principles, right, such as improving collaboration, improving cycle times, improving our backlog through more effective backlog refinement. We first started by kind of revisiting the team's charter. The original charter was based on the project, and then we kind of got the team back together, and we need to kind of realign on what we were trying to accomplish, right? So getting the team engaged and aligning on those objectives was a critical starting point for us. From there, we were now able to kind of better refine that backlog, right? There were also some workflow challenges that we addressed with our Kanban board. So we revisited the workflow for the team, made some revisions there. And because of the type of work the team was doing, that didn't lend itself to using Scrum. So the team kind of focused simply on, engagement, team engagement, the backlog, and improving workflow through the board, right? Kind of, as I mentioned before, managing things like cycle times. This was a much more practical approach. And so while still being able to leverage Agile principles. And notably, this project was governed under a traditional project methodology with Agile principles really being applied primarily to the execution stage of the work. So actually, I'm going to hand this one off to you, Harry. Talk about what you meant by applying Agile practices by the book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to be careful here to leave some time for questions too. So let me see if I could speak fast here. When we started, actually, when our CEO came, on board with the company in early 2018, he started a digital imperative. And then what that imperative did, in mid 2018, they started having like a Shark Tank kind of an event where, different parts of the business were coming to them, showing them, digital opportunities and getting funding from that centrally. So that central group actually then hired a company to help with the execution because a lot of us were new in Agile. So they hired a company, and that company actually made every team, that contracting company made every team who won the digital opportunity and got the funding follow Agile, and literally by Agile by the book. I mean, they mandated you have to have daily stand-ups. They mandated you have to have weekly, sprint reviews and retrospectives and planning events. And the team really got frustrated, within a few weeks here. So we then gave that feedback back to our executive leadership, and they quickly reacted to that. And really, we regrounded ourselves in Agile with the Agile mindset. And the motto of from that day onwards became, be Agile as you do Agile. Right. So it's not just about, following it by the book, and the teams then were allowed to discuss what works best for them. They might not choose the right, they might pick up 3 weeks of iteration, which might not be right, but it's okay. They are deciding, and let them decide it. they will learn through retrospective that they maybe need to, shorten their sprint or lengthen their sprint, and let them empower them, because that's another big deal, with Agile. Empowerment is an outcome of, applying the Agile the right way. So when the teams come to us, asking us, should we be doing, weekly or bi-weekly Scrum events? Should we be doing all the Scrum events? What we don't tell them any of that. We tell them you need to focus on some of the basic building blocks of Agile. And number one is making your work visible. Because in today's world, everything being digital, everyone, have their to-do list either in their heads or in their individual OneNotes or Excel spreadsheets. So making all the work visible for a team at one place is a key building block to that. And once you're able to do that, that enables prioritization. And it was really great to see our chairman saying the same thing in a recent town hall. Mike Ward said, as big as we are, with the resources we have, with the smart people we have, we can do anything we want as a company, but we cannot do everything. So we need to start prioritization. And that was pretty inspiring for the whole workforce, for the whole organization. So, making your work visible, prioritization, and then managing capacity, just having good work-life balance on how teams are not, overwhelming and, having burnout through these, just working on projects and whatnot. And the fourth building block is really iterating and having a frequent feedback loop and delivering value, fast and often. So as long as you kind of, ground yourself with that, we don't care. You decide how frequently you want to do it, which events you want to do, so that was one kind of the learning from that pitfall. And the other big learning I wanted to quickly share is around organic growth. We had a conversation with our leadership, should we have some metrics around Agile? Should we target to get this % of Agile? And our leadership said, no, we want to go a different direction. We want to grow organically. And what that means is let's not push Agile to the people. Let's have people, try it out. And if they like it, build on that success. And as people, and we saw a lot of that, as people saw and enjoyed that way of working, they started self-adopting it, in their way of working. So we really grow organically as a team, as an organization, and also at a team level, right? I remember in one of the conversations, Rob was, talking to our safety team in health and safety, where they were like, okay, we want to go Agile. And one of the Agile coaches was, okay, you need to make your work visible. Let's start also having prioritization, managing capacity. And I really like how Rob kind of responded to that. Let's not put all of that together. Let's just step one, let them make their work visible. Let them iterate on it. And then they will naturally get to the prioritization phase. And then they will naturally get to, making your capacity. So that was another thing, at a team level, teams were growing organically, right? We were not pushing all the process pieces to them on day one. We were kind of saying, okay, go try it out, learn from it. And then, in the next iteration, we're going to add a couple more, parts of the process. So I have a few other good examples, but again, I want to be careful of the time here. One other example I definitely want to share was, we were in a big planning event, and one of the persons came to me and said, Harry, Agile isn't working for us. I said, why? What happened? Like, Agile, we have too much work to do, and Agile isn't helping us, get all the work done. And then then I had to think a bit about that. The following day, we actually shared that with the team that, let's go back to the manifesto, Agile manifesto. And one of the Agile principles is maximizing the amount of work not done. So really kind of grounding the team, initially, and then reinforcing those principles time and again will really help to bring the team on board and really help them mature as they advance in this journey. So with that, Rob, I'm going to kind of hand you the last one here. Please share what do you mean by Agile is only for projects?
Sure. So Harry, one of the other observations I made was that Scrum and even Agile approaches in general were being applied only to projects. So each time a project was initiated, a new Scrum team was formed. In most cases, team members were already part of multiple teams. With several hundred projects being initiated a year, that meant that several hundred Scrum teams would need to be launched every year. So from my experience, this was a sustainable model for the organization. The project being the hub and people being kind of assigned to projects as they always were. Basically, how projects were sourced and how capacity was managed had not changed, right? It was just the method of execution in terms of using Scrum that had changed. So people were kind of being fractionalized across multiple projects and teams, having to attend multiple, Scrum events. And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of stress for the team members. So Harry, you and I talked about this pattern, and we raised it with the issue with the GMO strategy. The idea was to introduce the concept of the persistent or stable team, where we would build these cross-functional teams around products or services. By taking this approach, right, the team becomes kind of the hub, and work is brought to the team, right? So whether it be project work or operational work, right, the goal was that no one should be part of one team. So it was important to prove that case, since the business had not experienced the persistent team model in the past. We saw an opportunity with a couple of projects that basically had the same people to kind of bring these folks together and kind of form a team that just simply does work, right? Project work, operational work. And so we developed a team charter around the goals and objectives of the team versus, say, a project. We merged and refined the backlogs. We launched the team in April, and it's become the model for kind of agile team success throughout Pipeline and Power, right? The transition wasn't without challenges. We took two teams that hadn't worked together, that had been working together for several months apart, brought them together, a few people from each of those teams. And so we had to learn to team again, right? We had to go through kind of the forming, storming, norming, performing stages all over again. And we've also since implemented that model across several other teams within Pipeline and Power, including our health and safety and environmental teams that you mentioned. And by the way, most of the teams, as I mentioned earlier, are using Scrum. One of the most recent ones that I'm working with is simply focused on making work visible. Our mantra is fit for purpose, and let's take baby steps, where they focus on emphasizing prioritization, reducing cycle times, continuous improvement, et cetera. I'm going to go ahead and move on here. We're just about out of time here, but I want to kind of take us back to the original question, which was kind of an interesting one, right? Which methodology is better? And I'd like to argue that the premise of the question is wrong, right? We're not here to say whether Waterfall is better or Agile is better, right? Even though I'm an Agile coach, right? The question really should be, in what context should I consider each methodology? Right? That's really the better question. And, so the decision is contextual, right? You wouldn't use Scrum to build a bridge, right? You wouldn't use a waterfall methodology to innovate, although we've all been there, right? We've all tried to do that, but we also know now, after many years kind of working in the Agile space, that, Scrum and frameworks like Scrum, where we can iterate, work much better on innovative projects than the traditional waterfall ways of working. So using one methodology or framework to another is contextual, right? Bottom line is it's contextual. So context matters. Methods and frameworks are simply tools. Understand the work. Think about things such as, what domain does this work fall in, whether it's complicated or complex? Is it predictable? Is there some discovery involved? And as Harry mentioned, right, just simply start by making work visible, right? You don't need to go crazy with a lot of training. And in some cases, we've launched teams by simply just starting with making work visible. We don't do any training. And it's worked really well. It's a different approach, but it's worked really, really well. And then, of course, understanding the context of your work will definitely help guide you in what approach might work best for your team. All right, so I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. Are there any questions out there that we can field?
I see a question, Rob, around that the teams are not dedicated, and a great question, right? I mean, today, if I go to a team and say I want you to be dedicated on Agile, then I'm not going to get them on board. But if I tell them, okay, well, let's start making your work visible, right, and then get them on board, because as a coach, and I'm really proud of Rob and the other coaches we've had. Really shout out to Dave Hardy and David Northcutt, also who've been leading us through this journey along with Rob here. As a good coach, you shouldn't be telling the team what to do. You should really ask the right question and let them figure it out. Because if you tell them, they probably are not going to do it. But if they figure it out themselves, then they're going to commit to it, right? So that's the approach we have taken. Be a good coach, and then not be don't make it a mandate. What are the questions, Stacey or Rob, you all kind of see from the chat here? Or please, anyone, feel free to chime in here too.
I see Katrina has raised her hand, so I'd like to hand it over to Katrina. Katrina. Did we lose her?
Sorry. I put this in the chat, but figured it was just better to have a visual cue of raising the hand. What I heard you say was that you start with Kanban when you're at the execution stage. So how are you managing and visualizing your backlog prior to the execution stage?
Yeah, I think the example I gave was that what we've seen, and this is not necessarily something we've been coaching to, is that some teams have been using, for example, if you think about a capital construction project, right? We're talking about non-IT related project, right? We're actually doing construction projects where teams are using maybe something like Scrum kind of in the early stages of a traditional project. And they're using that because they're still trying to figure out what the solution is, right? And then when they get to the kind of those traditional execution stages, they're used, they kind of switch over to Kanban. Again, it's not something we've been coaching to, but these are things that we're starting to see throughout the organization in ways in terms of how people are starting to apply some of those principles and practices.
Very good. I think there's another chat regarding some agile methods and Kanban. I don't know if you want to take one more question, then wrap it up.
Sure.
All right. Trying to find I lost my chat window. so you might have to go back to
This is David. Can I ask a question? I put a couple of questions in there. One thing you said is that you're using a backlog. Are you using that across the entire program when you're building, a bridge or whatever?
So we're at a point right now where we've been launching teams. We're starting to kind of get down the path of where we are now. We have so many teams that are launched. We're starting to figure out, well, how do we keep those teams aligned, right? So that typical program model that you might see in, say, SAFe, remember, so Harry and I are working on the business side, right? This is kind of different than IT. IT is actually using some of the SAFe framework in kind of how they're managing their work and their backlog. So we're actually starting to kind of move to kind of more of that, program level management where we've got multiple teams kind of working in the same area on some common strategies. And we're starting to kind of delve into kind of that quarterly planning where, we'll eventually end up having kind of a single backlog, which might be more of a feature backlog or even an epic backlog that kind of may kind of help guide the teams in terms of what needs to be accomplished. But today, each of the teams are basically managing their own independent backlogs.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we are getting to that point, Daniel, where we kind of start managing at a portfolio level and not just at a team level. Yeah, we are scaling. We're not there yet, but yeah, absolutely working towards it.
And just one last question is, have you compared other projects? Can you say that yes, we're doing this 6 months faster than we've done before?
That's a good point, actually. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, we one of the things we do is we were doing kind of like little case studies for the last year and a half on, just certain projects that we were kind of making this transition over to. And we are seeing that we are able to execute projects faster because I think it's a big part of it is that kind of relentless prioritization and kind of focusing on that MVP. It's not necessarily that we were taking 12 months of work and getting it done in 3 months, but we're kind of focusing on what's essential. And so we are starting to see that things are getting done faster, or at least in terms of kind of getting that MVP done.
Okay.
Very good. I see Daniel's hand, and Daniel, if you could wrap it up with one last question. Daniel from London.
Yes, hi. This is a question relating to complicated and complex. In Rob and Harry's experience, which would you consider complicated or complex? On learning how you used to work or learning the new ways of how you should be working?
I would say probably learning new ways of how you're working.
Okay.
Yeah, and I
because
think
there's discovery involved, right?
Yes, yeah. The reason I ask is one of the challenges, especially when you're working with engineering teams or, especially in the energy sector, is they've been so used to learning. Some of them have been in the company for 25 years, and that's the only thing they do. So it's harder for them to unlearn and then apply new ways of thinking with the new agile mindset, than actually unlearn the old ways and then unlearn the new ways. So it's kind of like trying to understand in the context of, especially when working and you're looking at fast feedback and fast learning, what would you consider as complicated or complex? Would it be the unlearning or the learning of new ways?
Yeah, and that's actually been exactly what we've seen is people that have been doing things the certain way for, in some cases, decades. Having to shift that mindset around, we don't have a checklist anymore, right? There's a lot of gray areas in how we work right now. We're making decisions along the way, and it's not very predictable in terms of how we're working. So it has been a struggle for some people. And then there's, we've also had teams that, have kind of gone on this journey and they've just embraced it.
Yeah. No, I agree. The only thing I would add there is, it's not just us making, that big transformation in the company. It's starting at the top, right? With our new CEO, he's talked so much about growth mindset that, all of us, see every situation as, okay, am I, having a fixed mindset? Am I really not looking to explore the new ways of working? Right. So it's not just 1 or 2 or 10 people, doing this. It really starts at the top there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, guys. Love from London.
Hey, thank you, Daniel. And Rob and Harry, thank you for joining us and for sharing your experience and your insights. I love the references. And Harry, I love the reference that you just called out with Carol Dweck. And it's great to hear that Chevron is looking at growing its presence in other areas and looking with more innovative approaches to their work. And really proud of the work that you guys have done in publishing this paper. So congratulations on the paper. We'll make sure everybody has that link. And everybody, thank you for joining us for the Hyperdrive Lunch and Learn. We're glad that you're able to make it. This is going to be available on our website as a recording. So if you want to reference back to the article and some of the other information from Dave Snowden and Kneffin, we'll make those things available to you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.